So last week, a long-awaited report was released on flood control options for the San Francisquito Creek, which included the recommendation to entirely replace the Pope Chaucer Bridge. And here to unpack the topic is Tom Rindfleisch, the senior research scientist retired at Stanford and also the director emeritus of Lane Medical Library. Tom, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Your expertise, of course, comes from your long involvement with the San Francisquito Creek. And your neighborhood, as I understand, was affected by the 1998 flood. Can you just tell us a little bit about your history with the creek?
Yeah, we moved here in 1998. 1985. Okay. And my first awareness of the creek was I was at a conference in Seattle. My wife called at 3 o'clock in the morning saying the neighborhood had flooded. And I had not expected that. And this turned out to be the biggest flood in history for the creek. We had like 1.5 feet of water in our yard. Our crawl space was all filled. Our neighbors lost furnaces and water heaters that were under the house. And several days later, there was furniture and carpeting and all sorts of personal goods out along the street, which had been ruined by the flood. So,
whose responsibility was it at that time to take care of flood protection projects? Because the EAR we just mentioned was put together by the San Francisquito Joint Powers Authority, which is dedicated to flood protection. But at that time of the flood, 1998, that agency didn't exist. So I was hoping you could tell me, who was taking care of it and how did the response to that flood lead to the current structure?
I would say nobody. And the reason is that the creek runs between and is affected by 5 different agencies. The 2 counties, San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, and then Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, and Palo Alto. And these people were not coordinating what went on with the creek. The creek had been relatively benign before that, but this flood just yanked everybody's chain and made them aware that something had to be done. There were a number of people, Trish Mulvey, for example, and others in the neighborhood or in nonprofit organizations that pushed for the Joint Powers Authority because that was the only feasible way to bring together all of these other jurisdictions in a way that could work together.
And it sounds like you guys succeeded in doing that, but how long did that take and how hard was that, the process of setting up the authority, getting everybody to talk together and work together on this?
It took a long time. The people who were involved from the government agencies really were not hydraulic engineers or people that understood what was going on. And it's one of the reasons that our citizens group got together in 2002, 2003 to start really looking at what was going on with the creek, what was causing the flooding, and what could be done about it. A colleague at Stanford, a civil engineering professor, Stephen Monosmith, and I were the primary people who did the technical studies, but other neighborhood people, Steve Bissett and Trish and Xenia Hammer, were also involved in trying to promote this and make sure that the city council and other governmental agencies knew what was going on and it was important to take action.
It seems like you did have to push, you being the neighborhood group, push the JPA for quite a number of years, even after formation. Because we're at it now for 20 years, but it seems like from 99 to 2009, that was one period of time where, well, maybe you could speak to some of the barriers to progress.
I sort of divide things into 3 sections. The first section was an education section. That is, showing people what was going on using a modeling program that the Corps of Engineers had for how water flows down the creek and where it bunches up and doesn't. The second was to look at technical alternatives for how to control the flood. And then the third was, once a basic idea of what to do was set, to go through all of the political hurdles and permitting hurdles that were necessary to start to get things done. And here we are just now finishing or getting started on the political hurdles for the reach above Highway 101 to Middlefield.
And you're right in noting that you're starting on that one, but we should also give the JPA some credit for just completing what has been a huge project in the downstream section. You mentioned like there were a couple of phases. I think 2008 is when Len Maderman joined the Creek Authority, and for nearly a decade he's been trying to get the downstream thing done. And just last year, I believe they completed it. There's new paths, new trails, widened levees. So are you and your neighbors kind of heartened by the success of this agency to actually get something completed? Does that give you a sense of optimism that now that it's looking at the upstream area, it has a track record of sorts that it didn't in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go on record saying that Len Maderman taking over the Joint Powers Authority was a sea change event that changed what had been a fairly docile and drifting agency into something that was actually taking action. Len has the technical understanding, the political skills, and the perseverance to bring this off. And we would not have the Highway 101 to Bay segment of this project done by now if it weren't for Len. The other thing I want to say is that the people in Crescent Park also have been very patient. There are people who, when the big flood came and we pointed out that it was really Pope Chaucer Bridge that was causing all the difficulties, were ready to buy sledgehammers and go out and take down Pope Chaucer Bridge, which is ethically not possible because you've got to start at the downstream to fix it so that when you let more water through upstream, it doesn't drown them out.
Yeah, because it becomes like a domino effect, right? If you remove that, then you have more problems in Newell with water flooding there.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, before the webcast started, the interesting sort of geological nature of the creek being a little higher up. What's that term you used?
Perched Creek.
Perched Creek.
Yeah, the creek drains a watershed that is about 45 square miles. It runs from Page Mill Road up to Highway 84 and comes down in a funnel so that all of the rain that's gathered up there that isn't soaked up in the soil runs down into San Francisquito Creek. And San Francisquito Creek is a creek that is quite unusual. Normally you think of a creek as at the base of a valley that runs down. And San Francisquito Creek is higher than the surrounding terrain, so that the banks, once the water goes over the banks, the water doesn't go back into the creek. The water flows away from the creek and down, to the low spot. So when 1998 happened, once Pope Chaucer Bridge was topped, the water flowed out into the neighborhoods and ended up down at Oregon Expressway and 101. Yeah. There's a huge lake. There's a video that the Santa Clara Valley Water District made from a helicopter the morning after. The flood happened in the middle of the night. And that video is really revealing, the disaster. The golf course was underwater, the airport was underwater, Highway 101 was closed for several days because of leaks through the culvert under 101.
I think that's why the Creek Authority decided to focus on that area first, downstream, because that was the most urgent.
Correct.
And now they're moving up to kind of the area closer to where you live. And as part of this effort, they looked at 17 different alternatives as part of the EAR, everything from building pump stations, building a new Ladera Dam, removing the bridge altogether, having a bike bridge. There's so many of them. The one that they ended up with, and the one that their preferred alternative, is replacing the Pope Chaucer Bridge, and in 5 sections of the creek, widening the channel, removing concrete and whatever to improve the flow. The EAR concluded that's the preferred alternative. I'm just curious whether you agree that of all the options, this is the best option.
I wholeheartedly agree.
What makes it better?
Our neighborhood group actually came up with a precursor of this idea long ago. And in addition to exploring other kinds of things, as you said, we're looking at bypass channels, for example, something down Willow Road, and that would have to be roughly the size of the culvert through the Pope Chaucer Bridge, which is 16 feet in diameter. If you can think about building a trench down a road from Middlefield to the bay, where they've got sewers and gas and water and all the utilities. I mean, you'd really be tearing apart the whole Menlo Park. And so those ended up being very, very expensive. And others were not very technically effective.
The overland floodways, basically using streets. I feel like that wouldn't fly so well.
It's reminiscent, actually, of the 1998 flood, where the streets were used.
It's almost like the do nothing alternative.
My other argument for using the option 2 is it maximizes the capacity of the creek itself. If you take out all of the human contributions, like Pope Chaucer Bridge and building people's houses that built concrete into the creek to obstruct flow, if you take all of that stuff out, the creek almost without any problem handles the 1998 flood. And if we couple this with other options in the future, like the Searsville Dam option or other upstream detention, having maximized the capacity of the downstream part from Middlefield to the bay means that with climate change, we don't know how long the storms are going to last in the future. They tend to be getting more extreme. And so having that capacity that doesn't depend on how long a detention basin takes to fill up, that is, if you've got the capacity in the creek, it can flow all day long and you're not going to do any more harm.
And it does seem like of the three alternatives that they narrowed things down to, that seems to be the most kind of back to nature approach. The other big one that they analyzed fully was replacing the bridge and installing flood walls, which, from what I understand, wasn't a particular popular proposition in your neighborhood. So can you talk a little about that alternative and why that didn't fly with a lot of your neighbors?
Well, it was almost an accident that the big flood wall thing was done first. None of us really thought that was a good idea, simply for aesthetic and practical reasons. There are already flood walls down between the Newell Road Bridge and Highway 101. On the East Palo Alto side, there are flood walls that get up to 8 feet high, and those were put in quite a long time ago. But the reason that I think that's a better idea, the human intervention in the creek, starting with Pope Chaucer Bridge, which was put in the late 40s, right after World War II, and then the diversion of the creek downstream, have caused all of these difficulties. And I think we should not overlook the fact that those interventions really are the cause of why we're here now. The natural creek has the capacity, basically, to carry the flows that are coming out of the watershed.
That seems to be kind of the theme between the various projects that the Creek Authority is pursuing, trying to kind of bring things back to before people made structures. Because we also saw it with the levee, to some extent with the Palo Alto Golf Course, which is sort of a related. Mm-hmm. A third alternative that the AAR looked at that I know you're very well familiar with, and that's asking Stanford to devote some land to a detention basin. And I know you and Trish Mulvey and others served in a citizens group that kind of advised Stanford on this issue. Can you tell me a little about your experience with the Searsville Dam issue and where you see that going from here?
Sure. We sat on this citizens advisory group for 4 years, I think, ending in 2015. And Stanford, on their nickel, hired an outstanding civil engineering group to look at alternatives that ranged from taking out Searsville Dam, building side detention things, carving channels around the dam so that fish could get up, and so on. I mean, it was really an elaborate study. And we ended up with what in option 2 alludes to a change to Searsville Dam where it's almost full of silt after 100 years of operation. And so take out the silt, dry it and put it aside, and then put a hole in the bottom of the dam. And that hole would be sized such that it would not allow a flow higher than what the new Pope Chaucer Bridge could contain. Anything that was above that would be held behind the dam. And it has the advantage that that hole allows fish to go up the stream. So, you know, the salmon that everybody wants to save could get through the dam, which it can't now. They can't now. And it turns out the numbers just match so that if you make the hole the right size, Searsville could hold back what it takes to get to the 100-year flow level. whereas the option 2 just gets to the 1998 flow level, which incidentally is the level of history. Right. There have been no flows before that anybody knows about. That.
We're going to knock on wood. I think that's considered like a 70-year kind of level.
It is now. When we first did this, it was a 50-year level.
Oh, okay.
But people have been changed. The Corps of Engineers and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, have been changing their estimates of what the 100-year flood is.
I want to ask you about when your meetings with Stanford, or from what you can tell, between working on the dam versus creating detention basins, does the university seem to favor one method over the other?
So the university, there were two committees. One is the Citizens Committee that I was on and Trish was on, and the other was a faculty and university management committee, which took these inputs and the studies from the civil engineers and then finally came up with a recommendation. That recommendation is wholeheartedly for the Searsville dredging and hole in the bottom to control flooding. It has the advantage of being an inline solution. That is, the water always goes through Searsville. You don't have to turn a tap or change a floodgate. If you have off-site detention, you've got to somehow arrange for the creek to decide not to push the water downstream, but to push it sideways so it goes in the detention basins. And that's either an automatic system that gets used, once every 50 years or something, or is something that a human being has to get involved in.
Basically build channels to the basins.
Yeah, and the problem is that you've got to have that gravity fed. And the terrain up there is not easy to put pipes in so that the water is going to flow happily down into those detention basins. So for me, the Searsville Dam option is ideal. And that coupled with, as I said, with the option 2 that the JPA is talking about really gets us to the 100-year flood level.
I want to ask about funding for a second, because it seems to me that there's sort of two options whenever you undertake a huge project. One is, let's do it quickly, let's do it now, we want to minimize the risk. We may opt for something that is less than ideal, because we can fund it, versus let's go for the moon and we have to find out where the funding is going to come from. It sounds like this option, happily, is going to address the 100-year flood, this preferred alternative with the replacement of the bridge.
If Stanford does its thing by itself.
Yeah, comes in. So the funding question still remains, though.
So the EIR is strictly aiming at containing the 1998 flood level. That's not the 100-year level. And so that's along the lines of the philosophy that you mentioned. Don't let the perfect delay or get in the way of what's practical, what can really make a difference. And I think all of the people in the neighborhood and I think in the government agencies now are coming to the view that this is an extremely good intermediate solution. It gets to the biggest flow that has ever occurred or been noted, and it can be done with reasonable money. I mean, most of the other options, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And this, I don't know what the number will ultimately...
About 35 million current estimates for the...
As a computer scientist, my normal reaction is double that or triple it. Okay, we'll see what it comes out.
Yeah. But Pope Chaucer, you've been intimately involved with this particular bridge, but as you know, it's one of two bridges that the city is now considering replacing. There's also the Newell Bridge, which is a project that the city of Palo Alto is leading. It's related to JPA, but it's a Palo Alto-led issue. And in talking to Trish Mulvey and Noam Beamer and some of the other people kind of in Crescent Park, Dubnik area, they're adamant that Newell Bridge should be done first before Pope Chaucer, because as you mentioned earlier, you can't just push water from one area to the other. Are you concerned that the Newell Road project will delay Pope Chaucer? I mean, because everything seems great right now politically in your area, but how big of a concern is the Newell project for you guys?
If you attended the public meeting, I think maybe almost 5 years ago now, at the Lucy Stern Center, it was a debacle. I mean, it was clear that there were two sides, those who lived near Newell Road Bridge and those who were more interested in the overall creek issues, flooding issues. And the people on Edgewood who have a strong concern about traffic and parking and other issues with the Newell Bridge, which is this little narrow horse and buggy bridge.
18 feet has been deemed substandard and obsolete by the
Yeah,
state.
they absolutely refuse to think about other options for the bridge. From my point of view, from flooding, the only issue is to make sure that whatever goes in there or is taken out can handle the flow capacity that we're putting into the entire creek. And as a citizen, I think that the need for first responders and other vehicles to get from one side to the other makes it desirable to have some kind of bridge there. Whether you control the traffic that can go through there with bollards or other mechanisms, I think there's a solution where you can solve both of those problems. I'd like to add again that the Pope Chaucer Bridge, I think, was the biggest mistake that the city has made in a long, long time. That was put in the late 40s and is the result of all of the other stuff that we have been talking about. If the Pope Chaucer Bridge had not been there, then, which limits the flow all downstream to like 5,000 cubic feet per second, that means that the people who built things after the Pope Chaucer Bridge went in, which is basically a dam with a hole in it, did it to a set of criteria that were at very low flow levels. And so if we take Pope Chaucer out, we just have to do all of the fixes downstream so that the water gets contained. And Newell is a political issue that I think is going to be difficult to resolve. I'm hopeful that people can be reasonable and rational even in this age of politics and diverting points of view. So we'll see.
The EIR isn't out on that yet, right? The
No,
report came out saying that the EIR would come out.
It should be coming soon, yeah. I know you've probably heard that for a while.
It's been coming soon for 2 years.
Yeah. Well, they said spring 2019, which is any day now, but it could be months. But I mean, I'm expecting it in the next few months, based on the report.
Yeah.
I think people were shell-shocked at the public meeting and have been hesitant to raise their head above the settlement.
Yeah.
5 years.
Yeah.
Tom, it's been great having you here to talk about the creek. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you just want to mention as kind of a final thought?
The only thing I would add is I really appreciate your taking the time to present this issue. And one of the biggest things that we have done over time is to try to educate the public so that we don't always have to go back to square one every time something is proposed. And the more we can do to make the public aware of what the issues are and what the trade-offs are, I think the better off we'll be, and I thank you for that function.
Well, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. Thanks for watching. If you think that there are other people who would be interested in this topic, just go below and hit the share button to share this on social media or email. And we'll see you next week.